You've been told that pure bloodlines is something racists invented. And honestly, fair enough. But here's what's strange. Geneticists actually do rank populations by something called genetic isolation. They measure it. They publish peer-reviewed papers about it. They have conferences about it. And when you look at the results, they don't match what any race scientist ever predicted. Not even close. One of the populations that ranks highest by every metric is a group that spent 2,000 years being told their bloodline was inferior, disposable, and worth erasing. We'll get to that. First, let's talk about what pure actually means when a scientist says it, because it has almost nothing to do with how most people use the word. Genetic isolation is about founder effects and admixture. When a small group of people gets cut off from the rest of humanity, by geography, by culture, by violence, by choice, and they stop interbreeding with outsiders, their genetic variation narrows. The same variants get passed down generation after generation. Mutations accumulate in patterns. If you sequence enough people from that population, you start to see a very tight cluster, very little noise, a lineage that, by the mathematical definition, is highly uniform. That sounds like an advantage. It isn't necessarily. Genetic isolation also means certain rare diseases become common. Carrier rates spike. Specific hereditary conditions that would be diluted out in a larger, more mixed population get concentrated and amplified. The Amish in Pennsylvania, one of the most genetically isolated communities in North America, have unusually high rates of specific metabolic disorders that are virtually absent in the general population. The same variants, cycling through the same families for centuries, so isolation is a double-edged thing. And when scientists started doing large-scale population genetics in the 1990s and early 2000s, sequencing thousands of people, mapping haplotypes, tracing migrations across tens of thousands of years, they found that the most isolated populations weren't who anyone expected. The Basques of northern Spain and France have the most ancient genetic profile in Western Europe, pre-Indo-European. Before the farmers arrived from Anatolia, before the steppe herders pushed in from the east, the Basques were already there. Their language, Euskara, has no known relatives. Not a single other living language connects to it, and their DNA reflects that isolation. They carry gene variants that essentially disappeared everywhere else on the continent. If you're building a genetic timeline of Europe, the Basques are the clock that's been running the longest without interruption. The Sardinians are similar in a different way. They're the closest living relatives of the early European farmers who arrived from the Middle East around 9,000 years ago. In mainland Europe, those ancient farmers got mixed with incoming populations over millennia. In Sardinia, surrounded by the Mediterranean, that mixing happened far more slowly. A Sardinian genome today looks, in certain clusters, closer to a Neolithic farmer than to a modern Italian from the mainland. That's not an insult, that's a snapshot of deep time. Iceland comes up in almost every conversation about genetic isolation, and for good reason. The country was settled by a small founding population, Norse settlers and Celtic slaves and servants, in the 9th century. Then it stayed. People didn't immigrate to Iceland in significant numbers for the next 1,000 years. The country maintained genealogical records going back centuries that are nearly unparalleled anywhere in the world. And in the early 2000s, a biotech company called Decode Genetics began sequencing the entire Icelandic population. They now have genomic data on over half the country. The founder effect is visible in the data like a signature. Iceland is, in a technical sense, one of the most scientifically documented isolated populations on Earth. Then there are indigenous Australians. They carry one of the oldest continuous genetic lineages outside of Africa, somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years of unbroken habitation on a continent they reached before anyone else reached theirs. Before agriculture, before writing, their DNA diverged from other non-African populations earlier than almost any other group on Earth. In terms of the raw age of a lineage, the sheer length of time a people has existed as a distinct genetic population in one place, indigenous Australians sit near the very top of any list you want to build. And then there's the one nobody saw coming, Ashkenazi Jews. By the middle of the 20th century, this was a population that had just survived the most systematic attempt to destroy it in recorded history. Before the Holocaust, Ashkenazi Jews numbered around 16 million worldwide. By 1945, roughly 6 million were dead. What remained were survivors who had already been, for centuries prior, one of the most endogamous populations in the world. Endogamous meaning marrying within the group, not always by choice. Often because surrounding societies enforced separation through law, through ghetto walls, through exclusion from trade guilds, land ownership, universities. The genetic result is extraordinary. Population geneticists have traced the modern Ashkenazi Jewish population back to a founding group of roughly 350 individuals who lived in medieval Europe around 1,000 years ago. From those 350 people, a population of more than 10 million was eventually built. That's a bottleneck so extreme that today, two unrelated Ashkenazi Jews are, on average, as genetically similar to each other as fourth or fifth cousins in the general population. The shared DNA segments are that consistent, that measurable. Researchers studying hereditary disease discovered this almost by accident, because Ashkenazi Jews have elevated carrier rates for a specific cluster of conditions: Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, familial dysautonomia. These don't appear because of anything the population did. They're the mathematical signature of an extreme founding event encoded in the genome, a record of how few people carried a lineage forward. Here's the part that should make you stop for a second. The ideology that sent 6 million of these people to their deaths was built explicitly on the concept of racial purity, that some bloodlines were superior, that some were contaminated, that the Jewish people specifically represented a kind of genetic corruption that had to be removed. And what the science shows, what the actual peer-reviewed data shows, is that by every genetic metric of isolation and lineage continuity, Ashkenazi Jews rank among the most genetically distinct and traceable populations on Earth. The people who claim to be protecting racial purity had in fact far more admixed and variable genomes than the people they targeted. The science didn't confirm the ideology, it inverted it completely. And this brings you back to the word in the title, pure, because what the research actually reveals is that genetic isolation isn't a mark of greatness. It's a record of hardship. The Basques survived by retreating into mountains. The Sardinians were surrounded by sea. The Icelanders sat on the edge of the habitable world. Indigenous Australians were separated from the rest of humanity by an ocean for 50,000 years. And Ashkenazi Jews were isolated by centuries of legal exclusion, persecution, and forced separation from the communities around them. Every pure bloodline on this list is pure because something kept them from the rest of humanity. Geography, violence, walls, every single one. Purity is not a crown, it's a scar. And if you want the deepest, oldest, most genetically diverse human lineage on Earth, the one that carries more variation than any other, the one that is in the truest biological sense the root of the human family tree, it's the Khoisan people of southern Africa, the San, a population that has been in continuous existence longer than any other human group anywhere, not isolated and narrow but ancient and vast in their variation, the genetic ancestors of everyone alive today. Which means if there's a source of purity at the origin of the human species, it looks like southern Africa around 300,000 years ago. Everything else, every migration, every founding event, every isolated island and mountain valley, is a branch off that tree, a narrowing, a subset of what began there. That's what the research actually says. Not a hierarchy of superior bloodlines. A map of how hard different peoples had it and how long they survived anyway. Drop a comment if there's a specific population you want to know more about. I read them, and the ones that keep coming up tend to become the next video. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is probably the right moment.